They didn't say they were locking me in. They said I'd be safe here. That's the thing about betrayal, isn't it? It never wears its own name. It comes dressed in love, wrapped in concern, sounding exactly like your own best interests. I didn't scream when they took my keys. I didn't beg when they emptied my handbag and left my phone sitting on the hallway table back at the house I'd polished and loved for 40 years. I just stood there, right in the middle of the lobby at Rose Hill Care, trying to understand how the world had shifted under my feet in the span of a 20-minute car ride. My son, Thomas, my only boy, the one I used to rock to sleep when the thunder got too loud, kissed my cheek and whispered, "It's temporary, Mom, just until we make sure you're okay." Then he turned around and walked out those sliding glass doors. I waited 10 minutes, then 15, then 25. I stood there, watching the rain hit the glass, waiting for him to realize he'd forgotten me. Finally, I turned to the young woman behind the desk. She had on that bright, aggressive shade of red lipstick and a nursing badge that said, Sandra. I asked her when I'd be allowed to leave, and she looked at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The kind of smile you give a child who's asked for the moon. "You're checked in, Mrs. Leland," she said. "You're a full resident now." I told her I hadn't signed a single thing, even though my voice was starting to tremble like a leaf in a gale. Sandra gave me a patient, practiced look and said, "Your son did. He has power of attorney." I didn't cry then. I couldn't. I just followed her to room 213, listening to the squeak of her rubber-soled shoes on the linoleum and wondering how a mother could be so wrong about the man she'd raised. They brought me into that room, and the first thing I noticed was the door. It was chipped at the bottom, and the handle stuck when you tried to turn it. The bed was made so tightly, that hospital-style tuck that makes you feel like you're being pinned down before you even lie down. The closet was half empty. My clothes were there, but not all of them. Just the practical things. The sensible things. A single framed picture of my late husband, Harold, sat on the windowsill. It was a detail meant to make the place feel like home, but it felt like a taunt. Home was 117 Dare Lane. Home was the pale yellow bungalow with the creaky porch swing and the hydrangeas I've trimmed every single summer since 1984. Home was my kitchen chair, second from the end, with the worn cushion that perfectly fit the ache in my hip. Home was the house I'd bought with Harold, paid off with grocery store budgets and broken wrists from waitressing through my 50s, and just like that, home was gone. That first night, I didn't sleep a wink. Every 30 minutes, someone shuffled past my door. I didn't know their names, and I didn't want to. I wasn't staying. This was all just a terrible mistake. A misunderstanding that Thomas would fix as soon as he cleared his head. I remember staring at the ceiling, tracing the patterns in the acoustic tiles, thinking about the last time Thomas had visited me at the house. He'd been so helpful, moving boxes, suggesting I declutter. I thought he was being a good son. I didn't realize he was inventorying my life for a liquidation sale. By the next morning, the reality started to sink in like cold mud. I asked the nurse when I could speak to someone in charge, and she told me the administrator was only in on Wednesdays. It was Monday. I told her I wanted to call my son, and she looked at her chart, then looked back at me with that same pitying expression. "No phone privileges listed under your care plan, Mrs. Leland," she said. My care plan? I wanted to laugh or scream, but I just sat on the edge of the bed and folded my hands. Have you ever felt that? That moment when you realize you've become a project to the people you love. When you've raised a man who can smile while putting his own mother in a nursing home, you learn real quick that noise won't get you anywhere. 3 days passed without a single call or visit. I spent most of that time staring out the window at a brick wall. Sandra eventually brought me a blue cardigan from my old house, saying Thomas had cleared out the closet and sent over what he didn't want to throw out. Throw out. I opened the bag and found one dress, a scarf, and my heavy winter coat, the one with the pocket that never quite zipped right. That coat was older than Thomas's marriage, but I held it like it was made of gold, because it was the only thing I had left that smelled like my own hallway closet. It smelled of cedar and lavender, and the faint, lingering scent of Harold's tobacco. It was a physical piece of my history in a room that felt entirely anonymous. "You're lucky," a woman named Hilda told me in the dining room. She was 90 and half blind, picking at a plate of mushy peas and chicken that tasted like wet cardboard. She told me her family had left her there 5 years ago and moved to Arizona without leaving a forwarding address. She said they sent a fruit basket the first Christmas, but then the mail just stopped. I didn't feel lucky. I felt invisible. Hilda warned me that if you complained, they wrote you up for a mood disturbance and made you see the therapist, who smelled like cough drops and deep, abiding sadness. I didn't want therapy. I wanted my name back. I wanted my keys. I wanted my kitchen window with the bird feeder that had the chipped edge where the cardinals like to sit. When I asked again about the phone, Sandra told me I could use the staff one in emergencies only. So, I waited until she was distracted by a delivery of medical supplies and dialed my son. It went straight to voicemail. I dialed my old neighbor, Jenny, but she didn't answer either. I wasn't even sure she still lived next door. That night, I took my winter coat and hung it on the back of the chair. The pocket sagged a little, and I slipped my hand inside absently, looking for a peppermint or an old grocery receipt. But my fingers hit something thick and glossy. I pulled it out, a lottery ticket. I stared at it like it had come from someone else's life. It was a Powerball ticket, the numbers filled in with bold black ink. I remembered buying it. It was the day Thomas had come over to help with the yard. I'd walked down to the corner store while he was trimming the hedges. I'd bought it on a whim, thinking of Harold, and how he always said our luck was right around the corner. The purchase date was just 1 week ago, the same day Thomas brought me here. I turned it over, looking for scribbles or scratches, but it was perfectly intact. For a long, long moment, I just stared at those numbers. Then, for the first time since I'd walked into Rose Hill, I smiled. Because in that moment, I wasn't just a helpless old woman in a drafty room. I was someone holding a secret. And maybe, just maybe, that secret was going to be the key to the door they'd locked behind me. You don't really notice how loud a place like this is until you're no longer welcome to the silence of your own home. Nursing homes aren't quiet. They're filled with sounds that nobody responds to. Coughs behind thin doors, television static from a room where the occupant has fallen asleep, and the slow, heavy footsteps of people who have nowhere left to go. I kept that ticket in my coat pocket for 3 days. I didn't tell a soul. Not even Hilda. I didn't even know if it was a winner yet, but just having it lit something up inside me. I'd been cold for so long, I'd forgotten what warmth felt like. On Thursday, I asked Sandra again to use the phone. "Emergency only," she snapped, her eyes glued to a clipboard. I told her my furnace could be on fire for all I knew, and she didn't even blink. She just said, "You don't live in that house anymore, Mrs. Leland." That sentence felt like a slap. In my head, I still walked through that house every night before I fell asleep. I could feel the scratch on the front door from Harold's old toolbox and the spot near the stairs where the floorboards groaned under my weight. At dinner, the peas were cold again. Hilda sat across from me, mumbling about a bridge club she used to run back in '62. Suddenly, she stopped and pointed her fork at me. "You've got quiet eyes," she said. I asked her what she meant, and she whispered, "Means you know more than you're saying." She was right. I waited until the night nurse came on duty, a young girl named Maya, barely out of high school, who spent most of her shift tapping away at her phone. She liked me because I didn't ring my bell for water or extra blankets. I was low maintenance. When she passed my room at 10:45, I stood in the hallway and told her I thought I'd left my hearing aid battery in my old coat at the front desk. She waved me toward the lobby, telling me to be quick. There were no cameras in that little corner, just an old phone with a scratchy dial tone. I looked up the lottery numbers manually on the website. Saturday's draw. I checked my ticket once, then twice, then a third time, until the numbers started to blur. 6 matches. I didn't scream. I didn't even gasp. I just stood there holding that scratchy plastic receiver while Maya scrolled through her texts a few feet away, completely unaware that the piece of paper in my pocket had just changed the entire balance of the world. $62 million, unclaimed. I walked back to my room slowly, like I was carrying something fragile. And I was. I was carrying my future. My mind was turning so fast it felt like it might come loose. What could I do? I couldn't drive. I didn't have a bank account. And my son had control of every penny I'd ever saved. But for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid. I was holding a secret so large it could swallow this whole building and spit it out as dust. I tucked the ticket deep into my pillowcase that night, unable to close my eyes. 62 million. It felt like a weight, but for once, it wasn't the weight of grief or abandonment. It was the weight of possibility. The next morning, Sandra handed me a schedule for group bingo and a craft session involving popsicle sticks. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I wanted to speak to a lawyer. She actually laughed. "What for, sweetie? You planning to sue the cook for the lumpy oatmeal?" I told her I wanted to draft a letter, and she just shook her head, reminding me that Thomas handled all my affairs. "I want a lawyer to confirm that's still legal," I said, my voice as steady as a church bell. She stopped smiling then. I told her that if she didn't help me, I'd report her for financial manipulation of a senior. I'd seen her taking the occasional $10 bill from Mr. Henderson's nightstand when he was sleeping, and I made sure my eyes flicked toward his room when I said it. She didn't know I was bluffing about the report, but she knew she was guilty. Later that day, I called my son again. Straight to voicemail. I left a message. "Hi, Thomas. I found something important in my coat. Something you might be very interested in. Call me back." I knew him. I knew the way he'd always been looking for a shortcut, a windfall. I wanted him to wonder. That night, I sat with Hilda again. She was telling me about her 4th husband, a man named Arthur, who apparently could fix anything except a broken heart. I wasn't really listening to the details, but I was listening to her soul. She was lonely. We were all lonely. I started thinking about names. Not my name, but the names of people who disappear into the background. I needed a specialist. Someone who could see through the mess Thomas had created. Thomas finally called back on Sunday morning, his voice sounding oily and way too cheery. "Hi, Ma," he said. "I got your message. Something important, huh?" There it was. No, How are you? No. Are the nurses treating you well? Just a straight line to the thing he might be able to take from me. I told him I'd found a piece of paper in my coat pocket. I let the silence stretch out between us. Have you ever noticed how silence is the only thing that actually makes some people tell the truth? They get so uncomfortable they start filling the gaps with their own guilt. What kind of paper? He asked. I told him it was just something I'd forgotten to throw away. He sighed and started in on the same old script. How I was settling in. How everyone said the place was top-notch. I looked around at the hallway where an old woman was arguing with a vending machine that had swallowed her dollar, and another man was crying softly into his pudding. Yes, I said. Very top-notch. He told me it was safer this way, that the house had stairs and I was forgetting things. I reminded him I'd only forgotten one appointment, and even then, it was because the bus was late. He brushed it off, saying Marcia was worried. I smiled to myself. He had no idea how wrong he was. After we hung up, I went back to my room and locked the door. I pulled out the ticket and laid it flat on the desk. $62 million. Still mine. I made a list. I'd need a lawyer, proof of identity that Thomas hadn't confiscated, a bank account he couldn't see, and most of all, I needed to play the part of the frail old mother for just a little bit longer. I spent the next few days being the perfect resident. I went to the craft sessions. I made a lopsided birdhouse out of popsicle sticks and painted it bright yellow, like my bungalow. I even laughed at Mr. Henderson's terrible jokes during bingo. Sandra seemed relieved. She thought I was adjusting. In truth, I was scouting. I found a newspaper in the common room and looked through the back pages for lawyers who specialized in elderly estate planning. I found a number for a firm downtown that promised total discretion. I memorized it, repeating it like a prayer, until the digits were burned into my brain. I called from the stairwell using Maya's phone when she went on her break. I told them I was calling for a relative who had been placed in a home under false pretenses. I gave a fake name, Elaine Matthews. I didn't want anything traceable to Doris Leland just yet. We set up a meeting for Thursday afternoon. I hung up the phone and pressed it to my chest, feeling my heart drumming a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. It was the rhythm of a woman who was still alive. Thursday came with a heavy gray sky. My hands were trembling as I sat in the lobby. At lunch, Hilda joked that I had a hot date because I'd actually brushed my hair and put on a little bit of pink lipstick I'd found at the bottom of my bag. In a manner of speaking, I told her. At 2:30, a dark green sedan pulled up, and a man in a neat gray suit stepped out. Andrew Myers. He didn't look like the lawyers you see on TV who yell and pound tables. He looked like the kind of man who was used to reading the fine print while everyone else was looking at the headline. We went to the back garden, a little concrete square with fake plants and rusty benches. I told him my son controlled everything and asked if we could contest the power of attorney. Then, I reached into my pocket and slid the envelope toward him. He checked the numbers, then checked the date on his phone, and then he looked at me. His eyes were wide, but his voice stayed low. "Does anyone else know?" he asked. I told him no. "Do you want them to?" "No." "Then we need to move quickly," he said. He told me he'd handled things like this before, people who think their parents are just bank accounts with wrinkles. He told me I'd need a new will, too. I told him I wanted everything to go to my granddaughter, Rosie. She was the only one who still called me to ask how my garden was doing, not to ask when I was going to sell it. Andrew stood up and told me he'd be in touch. He warned me to stay under the radar. "Don't buy anything. Don't change your routine. Don't give them a reason to look closer, he said. I've been under the radar my whole life, Andrew, I told him. I'm an expert at it. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "The pieces are moving. The board is set. I am Doris Leland, and I am not finished." By Saturday, the ticket was no longer in my room. Andrew had taken it to a secure vault. He'd set up a trust under the name Clara Whitmore. It was a name Harold always liked. He used to say if we ever had a daughter, we'd call her Clara because it meant clear and bright. We never had that daughter, but I had that name now. I asked Andrew where the money was, and he told me it was in a blind holding account, protected by a dozen legal layers. I wanted Rosie's portion locked until she was 30, but with access for her college and her own first home. Andrew was impressed. I told him that when you've lived through the Great Depression as a child and a recession as a widow, you learn how to protect what matters. I knew exactly what that money could buy, and more importantly, what it couldn't. It couldn't buy back the years Thomas had spent ignoring my calls, or the way Marcia looked at my old-fashioned curtains with such disdain. It couldn't buy back the time they'd stolen from me by putting me in this place. But it could buy a life where I didn't have to ask for a care plan to use the phone. After Andrew left, I felt a strange sense of mourning. The ticket was gone, and with it, the physical proof of my luck. Now it was just legal documents and promises. That afternoon, I sat with Hilda and watched the birds. She told me I had a glow about me. Like a woman who's just won a race, she said. I squeezed her hand and promised that if I ever got out, I'd make sure she got out too. She just laughed and said Arizona was too far for her old bones anyway. That evening, Rosie called. She was crying. She told me her dad had sold my car to a neighbor for a fraction of what it was worth. Harold's car, the one with the velvet seats and the radio that only played the oldies. I told her it was just metal and rubber, even though my heart was breaking. "Grandma, why aren't you mad?" she asked. "Because, honey," I told her, "it's hard to be mad when you're busy being ready." I smiled and told her I was just getting my strength back. After we hung up, I wrote another line in my notebook. "Car sold. Piano next, probably. Let them sell it all. It won't be enough to pay for what's coming." I dreamed of the ocean that night. Not a storm, but a calm, endless blue that went on forever. If you've ever been underestimated because you move a little slower than you used to, you know the power of being overlooked. It's like being a ghost while you're still breathing. I saw everything in Rose Hill. I saw the way Sandra would eat the desserts meant for the diabetic patients. I saw the way Mr. Kellerman, the administrator, would talk to us like we were 3-year-olds while he was actually skimming the maintenance budget. He told me the library was closed for safety, but I knew he just didn't want to pay for a librarian. This place was a warehouse, not a home. And I was done being inventory. On Friday, Thomas showed up again. He was driving my old car, but he'd cleaned it out. My crochet hooks were gone from the back seat. My spare umbrella was gone. He'd even taken down the little St. Christopher medal Harold had clipped to the visor. He walked in and told me I looked rested. I didn't say anything. He told me he was listing the house on Monday. He said it was the responsible thing to do. I reminded him that I'd paid for his college by working double shifts, and he had the nerve to tell me that was in the past. I saw the greed in his eyes clear as day. He wasn't even hiding it anymore. I told him I was tired and asked him to leave. When he tried to kiss my cheek, I turned my head. He didn't even notice. He was too busy checking his watch. I told him I'd found that reminder in my coat pocket, and for a second, he looked confused. Then he shrugged and walked away. He thought I was talking about a photograph or an old letter. He had no idea I was talking about his downfall. Andrew came back the following week, signed in as a grief counselor. The staff didn't even look at him twice. We met in the lounge, and I locked the door. "The funds are cleared," he whispered. $43 million after the government took their share. It was more money than I could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. Rosie's $10 million was tucked away in a trust she wouldn't see until she was ready. But she'd never have to worry about a tuition bill again. I felt a weight lift off my chest. I felt light, like I could float right out of that chipped room. Andrew told me the court date was set. We were going to revoke the power of attorney. He'd found evidence that Thomas had used my savings to pay off his own credit card debts, a clear violation of his fiduciary duty. I felt a pang of sadness then. My son was a thief. I'd raised a man who would steal from his own mother. But the sadness didn't stay long. It was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "They won't get a cent," I said. Andrew agreed. He told me the court would have an injunction ready to stop the sale of the house. I slipped the papers into my knitting bag and thanked him. He told me most people in my position would be screaming, but I told him I'd already done my screaming. Now I was just doing my work. That night I wrote, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." I'd read that in a book Harold used to love. I lay in the dark and felt the power of those words. I started spending more time with Lillian in room 107. She was a former librarian, and she was the only person in the building who didn't treat me like I was fading. She said that being old was just like being a classic book. Some people only look at the worn cover, but the story inside only gets better with time. We had tea every afternoon. She told me she'd been at Rose Hill for 5 years and had seen a dozen people come and go. She said the trick was to keep something for yourself, something they couldn't see. I told her about the ticket, and she didn't even blink. She just asked me what kind of tea I was going to buy when I was free. I told her I'd buy the most expensive Earl Grey in the world, and we'd drink it out of real bone china. She laughed and said she'd settle for a tea that didn't taste like the box it came in. We talked about her daughter, who lived in Tampa and hadn't visited since the previous Christmas. Lillian wasn't bitter, but she was realistic. She said children forget that their parents are people until they need something. I told her she'd always have a place with me, and she just patted my hand and told me to focus on my own escape first. We clinked our mugs to The Great Escape. That was the last night I saw her. The next morning, I went to her room and found the bed stripped and the window open. The air was cold. She went peacefully, a nurse told me. I sat in her empty chair for an hour, just staring at the wall. Nobody else seemed to care. It was like she'd never been there. I wrote in my notebook, "Lillian is free. I have to be next. The clock is ticking." I decided to set a trap. I had Andrew send a black Mercedes to my old house, the kind of car that screams money. He had a driver hand Marcia an envelope with an offer from a private developer for $1.3 million cash. I knew they couldn't resist. 2 hours later, Rosie called me. She told me her parents were celebrating because of the offer. She said her dad was already looking at new cars for himself. I didn't say anything. I just listened to the greed in her voice. Not her greed, but the greed she was witnessing. That night, Thomas left a voicemail saying we needed to talk about my future. He sounded like a man who'd just won the lottery himself. He had no idea I didn't call him back. I had the nurse help me print a letter stating that I was of sound mind and hadn't authorized any sales. I tucked it into my drawer. I wanted to see his face when the court told him he couldn't touch my house. The next day, Rosie told me her dad was stressed because the developer's lawyers were asking for my signature. I told her that some things can't be rushed. On Friday, Thomas and Marcia showed up at Rose Hill. Marcia was wearing a new designer handbag. I recognized it immediately. It was expensive. They told me I looked vibrant and tried to act like we were a happy family. The air in the visitors' lounge was thick with their lies. Thomas told me they'd decided to downsize my life so I wouldn't have to worry. I told him I wasn't dead and that his help was no longer required. The silence was deafening. I told them I knew about the piano and the car. Thomas tried to say he was just storing them, but I knew better. I told him he thought I'd be a quiet little old lady who would just fade away, but he'd forgotten who taught him how to fight. Marcia looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. They left in a hurry, and I watched them go from the window. They thought they were in control. They thought they were the ones making the moves, but I was the one holding the checkmate. The next time Thomas came, he was alone. He brought me liver and onions, a peace offering. He sat there and told me he'd panicked because of my age. He tried to blame the doctors, the house, the stairs. He even tried to blame me for being difficult. I reminded him that difficult women are the ones who change the world. He asked me about the important thing I'd found in my coat. I told him it was a reminder that I still had a voice. He laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound, and told me I'd always been dramatic. I told him I didn't need his liver and onions, and I didn't need his pity. I told him everything was already in motion. He looked at me then, and I saw a flicker of real fear in his eyes. He realized that the woman in front of him wasn't the mother he'd locked away. She was someone else entirely. He asked if we were okay, and I told him that okay was a long way off. After he left, I gave the food to Hilda. She said it was the best thing she'd eaten in years. That night, I watched them clear out Lillian's room. They did it so fast, like they were trying to erase the memory of her. It made me realize that if I didn't act now, I'd be next. I went back to my room and let myself grieve. Not for the things I'd lost, but for the person I'd had to become to survive. I realized I'd been so focused on winning that I'd almost forgotten how to live. I made a new list. I wanted a garden. I wanted a cat who didn't like anyone but me. I wanted to wake up and not hear the sound of a nursing cart in the hallway. I told Andrew to go ahead with the hearing. I didn't want to wait anymore. I brewed a cup of Lillian's tea and drank it, feeling her strength in every sip. On Tuesday, the legal office called to say everything was ready. I was going to court. That afternoon, I found Hilda staring at the elevator again. I gave her the envelope with the lawyer's number. I told her she deserved a life that wasn't lived in a lobby. She looked at me with those half-blind eyes and told me I was a good soul. I didn't say goodbye, because goodbyes are for people who aren't coming back, and I was going to make sure someone came back for her. In my notebook, I wrote, "Today is the day I take back my life." I sent the letter to Rosie, the one that told her everything. I told her that her father had made mistakes, but that she was the best thing our family had ever produced. I told her I loved her more than $62 million. I took the original ticket, the one Andrew had replaced with a certified copy for the vault, and I held it one last time. It was just a piece of paper, but it had been my lifeline. I tore it into tiny pieces and watched them fall into the trash. I didn't need the paper anymore. The power was already in me. The courtroom was small and smelled of old floor wax. I sat beside Andrew, feeling the weight of the moment. Thomas sat across from me, looking like a man who had lost his way. The hearing was fast. Andrew showed the judge the evidence of the stolen savings and the unauthorized listing of my house. The judge asked me if I wanted to stay at Rose Hill, and I told her I'd rather live in a tent than stay another day in that place. She looked at Thomas with such disappointment that he actually flinched. She revoked the power of attorney on the spot. I was free. I was legally, officially, and finally in charge of myself again. Thomas followed me out to the courthouse steps. He was crying, but I didn't know if it was for me or for the money he'd lost. He tried to tell me he loved me, but the words sounded hollow. I told him that love isn't something you say, it's something you do. And he hadn't done anything but hurt me. I told him I'd taught him how to be a man, and he'd failed the lesson. But I also told him that it wasn't too late to change, even if he had to do it without me. I walked down those steps and into a waiting car. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the ruins of my old life. I wanted to see the start of my new one. I left Rose Hill that afternoon. Andrew had found me a small white cottage by the sea. It was perfect. It had a porch that didn't creak and a garden that was waiting for me to plant something beautiful. When I walked into that cottage, I felt a peace I hadn't felt since Harold died. It was quiet. The good kind of quiet. The kind where you can hear your own thoughts and they're finally happy. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. I watched the waves come in and go out, and I realized that life is just like the tide. Sometimes it takes things away, but if you wait long enough, it always brings something back. I was no longer Doris Leland, the resident of room 213. I was Clara Whitmore, the woman with a garden and a future. I'd lost my house, my car, and my son's loyalty, but I'd found myself. And that was worth more than any lottery ticket. I wrote the final line in my notebook. I am home. If you've ever felt like you were being erased, I hope you remember my story. I hope you remember that you have a voice, and you have a name, and you have a right to be heard. We all have a secret strength in us, something that keeps us going when the world gets cold. Mine was a piece of paper, but yours might be a memory, a friend, or just the stubborn refusal to give up. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when everyone else was telling you to sit down? I'd love to hear about it. We're all in this together, and our stories are the only thing that actually belong to us. Thank you for listening to mine. It's a beautiful day out there, and I think I'm going to go for a walk. Not because I have to, but because I can. And that is the greatest luck of all. Remember, darling, it's never too late to come home to yourself. I certainly did, and the view from here is absolutely breathtaking. Take care of your heart, and don't let anyone ever tell you that your story is over. It's just beginning.